Not one Sith ever feared him. Darth Maul, Count Dooku, General Grievous, Darth Vader, Darth Sidious himself. 5 of the most dangerous beings the dark side ever produced. And not a single one of them, not once across 3 decades of war, betrayal, and galactic collapse, looked at Obi-Wan Kenobi and felt what the Sith call fear. That single fact is why the Sith are gone. Here is where it starts. Naboo, the power generator beneath the royal palace. Darth Maul has just done what he came to do. Qui-Gon Jinn is dying on the ground. The mission is complete, and now Maul stands at the edge of a pit, dragging the glowing tip of his crimson blade slowly along the metal rim, sending sparks down into the shaft below, almost leisurely, almost bored. Down there, clinging to a pipe in the wall with his bare hands, is a Padawan. No lightsaber, no master, no options. Maul looks down at him the way a predator looks at something already finished. He is wrong. What happens next in the space of 2 seconds determines the fate of the galaxy for the next 40 years. One movement, one strike, and the Sith Lord who had just killed a Jedi Master falls in half into the dark below, never seeing it coming. But here is the question that nobody in the dark side ever seriously asked. How? How does a Padawan disarmed, dangling over a drop that should have ended him, his master bleeding out a few feet away? How does he do that? Where does that come from? What is inside a person that makes something like that possible? The Sith never asked. They filed it under luck, under desperation, under the kind of adrenaline that occasionally produces impossible results in ordinary people. They moved on. They kept their eyes on the things that looked like real threats: Yoda, Mace Windu, Anakin Skywalker, and his burning hunger for power. Obi-Wan Kenobi went into their ledger as capable but manageable. Useful context, not a primary concern. And that mistake, that quiet, comfortable, utterly confident dismissal, is the most expensive error in the history of the dark side. Because the man in that pit was not ordinary. He was not desperate. He was not lucky. What he was is something the Sith tradition spent 1,000 years building itself to be completely unable to see. And in failing to see it from that first moment on Naboo all the way through to the end, the Sith handed the galaxy to the very thing they were trying to destroy. This is that story. And to understand it, you first have to understand what the Sith were actually looking for, and why Obi-Wan Kenobi looked like nothing they had ever been taught to fear. To understand why not a single Sith ever truly feared Obi-Wan Kenobi, you first have to understand what the Sith actually feared, what they respected enough to mark as a genuine threat, what they watched and tracked with the sustained, careful attention of predators who have identified something worth watching. Because the Sith did not fear weakness. They did not feel threatened by Jedi virtue, by the code, by competence in forms that reminded them of what they had left behind when they abandoned the light. What the Sith feared, what they genuinely marked as dangerous, was a very particular kind of power, and they only ever measured threat through that one lens. The Sith tradition, traced from its most ancient roots, through every form it took across thousands of years of galactic history, from the original dark side philosophers who first rejected the Jedi balance to the ancient Sith lords of Korriban, to the rule of 2 line that Bane had constructed with such cold and patient precision, was built on one foundational claim. That passion was the foundation of strength. That emotion was the fuel on which real power ran. The things the Jedi Order spent generations training its members to transcend and release and eventually lay down entirely: love, grief, fury, ambition, the desperate clinging need to control outcomes, the burning unwillingness to accept loss. The Sith took every one of those energies and fed them directly into their power. The more intensely you felt, the more the dark side responded. The more willing you were to let your need drive you past the limits that ordinary people accepted, the further you could reach into that darkness and draw from it. This created a very specific filter through which the Sith looked at the galaxy and everyone in it. When they assessed another Force user, a Jedi, a dark Jedi, a rival Sith, anyone whose connection to the Force made them potentially relevant to the Sith's calculations, they were not asking a simple question about combatability or raw Force strength. They were asking a much more fundamental question: what lives inside you? What do you want so badly that the wanting itself has become dangerous? What wound, what hunger, what unresolved thing at the center of your being can be found and pressed upon and turned into a point of leverage? The Sith looked for fire. They looked for the living flame of need and grief and desire that the dark side recognized as fuel, as resonance, as the thing that made someone ultimately reachable. Palpatine understood this more completely than anyone in the history of the Sith tradition. His entire project as Darth Sidious, the 1,000-year culmination of Bane's rule of two, the patient dismantling of the Republic from within, was in its final phase essentially a search for the right configuration of passion in the right person. Every significant appointment he made as Sith Master was a selection based on what burned in the selected. Maul was chosen as a young child specifically because of his fury, his capacity for absolute consuming violence, the ferocity so complete it had become almost a philosophy in itself, a worldview in which destruction was the highest truth. He didn't merely fight, he obliterated. He was pure dark side aggression given training and direction and pointed at problems. Palpatine understood how to use that. Dooku was selected because of his disillusionment, which is a subtler species of passion but in some respects a more powerful one, because it is attached to genuine conviction rather than mere temperament. Dooku truly believed that the Republic was irredeemably corrupt. He truly believed the Jedi Order had drifted so far from the purpose it had been founded to serve that it had become an instrument of the very stagnation it was supposed to prevent. He had studied this. He had thought about it carefully across years of observation from his position inside the highest levels of both institutions, and his conclusion was real. His desire to tear down what was broken and build something more honest, more ordered, more genuinely just in its place, that burning conviction was exactly the kind of fuel the dark side could run on. It doesn't matter whether the conviction is right. What matters is how completely it consumes you. And Anakin, the entire 1,000-year arc of Sith planning, the entire architectural purpose of the Rule of Two, all of it was aimed in its final phase at producing the conditions under which a Jedi with Anakin's specific emotional configuration would be vulnerable enough to turn. Because Anakin Skywalker burned with more intensity than almost any Force user in recorded history. His love for Padme was so absolute and so total, so bound up in his fundamental sense of what made existence meaningful, that the mere possibility of losing her could crack the foundations of his identity in real time. His grief over his mother had driven him to a slaughter so complete and so dark that he had been horrified by it afterward, and then kept the horror secret rather than face what it meant about what he could become. His need to protect, his need to control, his absolute refusal at the deepest level of his being to accept loss. It was bottomless. Palpatine looked at Anakin Skywalker and saw a furnace so hot it could power an empire. He was correct. Now, take that same filter and run it over Obi-Wan Kenobi. Look for the fire. Look for the wound. Look for the burning, unresolved thing at the center of him that could be found and pressed upon and used. What you find is a man who meditates, a man who follows the code not as a cage, but as a practice. The way a serious musician follows scales, not because scales are the music, but because scales are how you keep the instrument in tune. A man whose fighting style is defined above all other qualities by patience, by the deliberate refusal to give his opponent anything to feed on, by an almost serene insistence on being present in the situation without being moved by its momentum. A man who, when his apprentice came dangerously close to the edge of the dark side, responded not with fury or fear, or the kind of emotional display that marks someone who has something personally and urgently at stake in the outcome, but with measured, honest, continuing engagement, the response of someone who can hold their concern and their love and their fear for that person all at once, without any of those things overwhelming the others or driving them off center. A man who, when everything he had built his life inside was destroyed in a single night, the Order gone, the Republic gone, his closest friend transformed into an instrument of the very darkness that had consumed everything, went to the desert, found a settlement on an inhospitable planet, watched over a child who did not know he was being watched, waited, not from defeat, not from cowardice, not from the dark side's reading of that kind of stillness as a man who has simply run out of options and gone to ground, but from an understanding of what the Force actually required of him in that specific moment that no amount of burning crusade or desperate warfare could have arrived at, from a clarity about what was real and what the real situation needed that was only possible because he was not being driven by passion. To the Sith eye, that picture looked like a Jedi who had been successfully completed and contained. A Jedi who had been trained so thoroughly into the code that all the interesting, exploitable, usable things about him had been smoothed away. No obvious cracks, no fire that could be detected, no wound deep enough to bleed into something that the dark side could reach into. No ambition that could be taken hold of and used to pull him off his center. He had lost his master on Naboo, lost his best friend on Mustafar, and he had not broken in any direction the dark side could recognize or work with. He had simply continued. That should have alarmed them. The specific quality they read as deficiency, the absence of fire, the absence of the thing they were built to find and use, was not an absence at all. It was the presence of something so different from their framework that their instruments returned nothing when they pointed at it. The Sith were built around the conviction that passion was the foundation of real power and that anything resembling detachment was its negation, essentially weakness. Essentially the absence of what mattered, wearing the clothes of philosophy. They could not conceive of a reality in which the equanimity at the center of Obi-Wan's being was not the absence of strength, but an expression of a kind of strength their entire tradition had been built to deny, a kind so foreign to dark side understanding that you could look directly at it for decades and see nothing worth fearing. They looked at him again and again across years of the same war. They fought him. They received reports of him. They watched him operate in the field alongside Anakin, and they filed him accordingly. Capable, reliable, present, not a primary concern, while keeping their real attention on the things that looked to them like real threats. And the filing was wrong. It was always wrong. From the first moment of its formation, the cost of that wrong filing simply hadn't arrived yet. Obi-Wan Kenobi did not begin as the figure people carry in their memory. The composed, quietly precise, philosophically settled Jedi Master who seemed constructed from a material that could not be rattled. He did not arrive in the galaxy in that form. He was shaped into it by training and by loss and by the particular irreplaceable experience of being raised in the Jedi way, by a master who approached the Force in ways that simultaneously expanded his understanding and strained his patience, sometimes within the same afternoon. Qui-Gon Jinn was, by every formal standard the Order had developed across its long history, a maverick. He prioritized what he called the living Force, the immediate, present tense, breathing energy of life and connection, and the specific, unrepeatable moment over institutional authority, over the considered pronouncements of the Jedi Council, over the long-pattern cosmic force that other masters spent entire careers trying to read and interpret. He trusted his instincts with a completeness that occasionally alarmed his colleagues and more than occasionally frustrated his apprentice. He took on causes the Council had not sanctioned. He made promises the Council had not approved. He saw potential in beings the Council had already decided were not worth the investment of time or training. He was, if you were observing from a position of orthodox Jedi sensibility, a Jedi who prioritized his own deep reading of the Force's will over the Order's preferred interpretation of the same. And that created friction in every direction. Obi-Wan loved his master with the specific devoted clarity of a student who had found exactly the right teacher, which meant his love existed in permanent close proximity to frustration. He was, by nature and by genuine conviction, an institutionalist. He believed in the Order. He believed the Jedi Council was made up of the wisest and most capable Force users the galaxy had produced, and that the accumulated wisdom encoded in the Jedi Code had been earned across centuries of hard experience and was not to be set aside lightly in favor of individual instinct, however refined. He believed that following the code carefully was not a limitation, but a foundation, not a constraint on what you could be, but the very structure that made it possible to be anything coherent at all. He thought, in the part of himself he would never have expressed to Qui-Gon directly, that his master could have been on the Jedi Council long ago if he had simply been somewhat less constitutionally committed to doing everything in the way that made most sense to him personally, rather than the way the institution preferred. He thought Qui-Gon was brilliant and saw things clearly that most other Jedi missed entirely. And he also thought that a significant portion of the difficulty in Qui-Gon's life was difficulty of his own making, friction generated by a principled stubbornness that could have been channeled more productively. He was partly right about some of this, and wrong about the more important parts. What he had not yet grasped, what took years of experience and grief, and eventually a very complete kind of solitude to fully understand, was that Qui-Gon's independence was not quirk or stubbornness for its own sake. His prioritization of the living Force over institutional authority was not a personality trait. It was a genuine and deeply thought understanding that the Force itself was more primary than any human institution that attempted to interpret it, that the Jedi Order, however noble and however necessary and however irreplaceable in the galaxy's ongoing story, was still a mortal creation, built by mortal minds across mortal time, subject to the drift and the blind spots and the slow political calcifications that every institution eventually develops when it has existed long enough, and the living will of the Force, expressing itself in the immediate truth of any given specific moment, was not subject to those same limitations. Qui-Gon could read that immediate truth in ways that most of his contemporaries genuinely could not. That is why he encountered a slave boy on a desert backwater and knew instantly, with a certainty that his later testing would confirm, but that preceded any testing, what he was looking at. That is why the Council's assessment of that same situation, the boy is too old, the risk is too uncertain, the disruption to established practice is not worth it, felt to Qui-Gon not like wisdom, but like exactly the kind of institutional risk aversion that proves costly in ways the institution doesn't detect until long after the cost has been paid. He was not cavalier. He was not impatient. He was operating from a quality of attunement to the Force's living reality that looked from the outside like unconventionality, but was actually something considerably more significant. Obi-Wan absorbed the code. He absorbed the discipline. He absorbed the methodology of his master's approach, even in the years when he didn't fully absorb the philosophy it rested on. And then Qui-Gon died in a reactor complex beneath a Naboo palace. And the process of Obi-Wan actually understanding what he had been given began in earnest. Grief is an extraordinarily efficient solvent for anything that isn't structurally true. You cannot maintain comfortable positions about the nature of the Force, or the nature of loss, or the nature of what you are and what you owe to life when someone you love has just been taken from you in front of your eyes. The comfortable positions dissolve, and what remains is what was real underneath them. What remained in Obi-Wan, when he made his way back through the grief to what was structurally real in him, was something that his training had built and his relationship with Qui-Gon had filled in, and his own developing quality of presence had begun to integrate. Something that was not going to collapse under pressure because it wasn't held up by anything that pressure could reach. He made a promise over a dying body. He would train the boy. He would see it through. And he kept that promise the way people made from a certain specific material keep promises completely, continuously. Even when the training strained every resource he had, even when he looked at Anakin in his most difficult moments and felt the full weight of everything he had committed to before he understood what that commitment would require. And in keeping that promise, across the years between Naboo and the full outbreak of the Clone Wars, and through the war itself, something happened to Obi-Wan that the Sith watching from their shadows could not track because their instruments weren't calibrated for it. He was integrating, slowly, without visible crisis, without the dramatic breaking and remaking that would have registered to dark side perception as a transformation worth noting. He was taking the two frameworks he had lived inside the formal Jedi discipline and the living Force philosophy his master had tried to give him, and finding the way to hold them both, not as competing claims, but as a single truth seen from two angles. The structure that gave you the discipline to be still, and the attunement that told you what the stillness was for. The lightsaber form he eventually mastered is the clearest external expression of that internal integration. Soresu, the third form in the Jedi Order's canon, was developed at a point in galactic history when blaster technology had advanced far enough that single Jedi were regularly facing multiple ranged attackers, and the older, more aggressive fighting forms were leaving openings that blaster fire was consistently finding. Soresu's answer was compression, smaller defensive movements, minimum necessary energy expenditure, tipped blade kept in close to the body in positions that could cover angles efficiently without requiring the large sweeping motions that generate both openings and fatigue. The practitioner becomes a smaller target. Every motion serves defense, and only defense. Nothing is spent that doesn't need to be. At its highest levels, and Obi-Wan reached higher in Soresu than any practitioner the Order had recorded in its history, the form transforms from a set of techniques into something that Jedi historians described in terms that bordered on philosophical. The practitioner is not simply defending. They are becoming the eye of the storm. They are making themselves into the calm at the center of whatever force is directed at them, absorbing and redirecting without yielding ground, maintaining the same quality of presence whether the storm is light or heavy, fast or slow. One opponent or many, they are waiting, with complete patience, with perfect economy, with the specific quality of stillness that is not the absence of awareness, but its most complete expression, waiting for the moment when their opponent has spent everything he brought to the fight, and then responding to that moment with exactly what it requires, and nothing more. This is the form Obi-Wan chose. This is what he spent years perfecting, until it was not a form anymore but a way of existing in combat. And the choice is not incidental. It is not simply a tactical preference. It is the direct expression of everything he was building internally. The patience, the centering, the quality of being genuinely present to what was happening without being swept into its emotional current. The understanding which his years of living had deepened from something Qui-Gon had pointed toward into something structural in him. That the Force is not something you push, it is something you align to. And when your alignment is deep enough, the things that push against you begin to fail, because what they are pushing against is no longer a person with gaps and tensions and exploitable emotional handholds. It is something that those pushes simply cannot move. The Sith, watching him develop across the years of the Clone Wars, saw a reliable Jedi. A very good one. They saw Anakin's partner and counterweight. The older, steadier presence who balanced the brilliant flame beside him. They watched Anakin with obsessive attention, tracking every fluctuation in his relationship with the darkness, managing every variable that might affect the timing of his turn. They filed Obi-Wan accordingly. And the filing was the first mistake, the original error, the wrong that every subsequent mistake followed from. It was always wrong. It just needed time for the consequences to arrive. When Darth Maul descended from the Sith infiltrator onto the Tatooine sand in pursuit of the Naboo royal convoy, he was everything the Sith tradition had spent more than a decade making. A weapon in the most complete sense of the word, every element of his existence oriented toward a single function, built with the care and the dark precision that Palpatine brought to everything he constructed. His physical training had been relentless since before he was old enough to have chosen it. His connection to the dark side was not a studied position or an adopted framework, but a lived experience, something his master had shaped into the fabric of who he was. At a level so fundamental, it was indistinguishable from his identity. He was fast in ways that Jedi combat doctrine had not calibrated to expect. Because Jedi combat doctrine had been built in an era without Sith to practice against, and 1,000 years of assumption had settled into it in ways that nobody had thought to question. He wielded a saber staff, a double-bladed weapon that added a layer of threat geometry to every engagement, requiring opponents to track danger from angles that conventional lightsaber combat did not prepare them to manage. He was by any available assessment, one of the most formidable combat entities the Order would encounter for a generation. When he descended onto that desert surface and faced Qui-Gon Jinn, in their brief initial exchange, a probe more than a duel, a mutual calibration, a test of the space between them, his threat assessment was running with the dark side precision that was native to him. He felt Qui-Gon registered a Jedi Master of genuine depth, someone whose decades of experience and attunement to the Force were evident the moment blades came into contact, someone whose Ataru form was fluid and powerful, with the specific quality that only comes from having lived inside a form long enough that it ceases to be technique and becomes movement itself. Here was something worth serious attention. Obi-Wan was aboard the ship, helping manage the Queen's evacuation. Barely a presence on the field. Barely, therefore, a presence in Maul's assessment. This was understandable. In strict isolation, Obi-Wan was a Padawan, had not yet completed the formal journey to Jedi Knight, had not accumulated the named engagements and the observable track record that constitute the conventional markers of Jedi stature. If you ran the standard evaluation on him at that specific moment in time, Maul's prioritization of Qui-Gon as the threat worth managing and Obi-Wan as the context around the threat was not obviously wrong. But it was wrong, because what Maul could not feel, what none of the Sith would ever be equipped to feel in Obi-Wan across all the years and all the encounters that followed, was what was present in him beneath the rank and the formal markers and the accumulated experience of completed missions. There was something in Obi-Wan Kenobi that existed prior to all of that. A quality that was not dependent on how long he had been training or how many enemies he had faced. It was already there. Already what it would spend the rest of his life becoming more fully. Maul scanned for the things the dark side taught him to scan for: fire, ambition, dark side resonance, the kind of Force presence that announces itself the way a storm announces itself before it arrives. And he found Qui-Gon, and he filed the Padawan accordingly, and he moved his attention elsewhere. They met in full on Naboo, all three of them now, in the great hangar bay of the Theed Royal Palace, the Queen's forces breaking toward the throne room, while Obi-Wan and Qui-Gon stepped forward to occupy Maul. What followed was remarkable by any standard, the first genuine duel between Jedi and Sith in memory. 1,000 years of absence collapsed into minutes of extraordinary violence. Maul drove them back out of the hangar and into the generator complex, into the labyrinth of catwalks and reactor shafts and cycling energy barriers, where the fight became something between a duel and a pursuit, Maul controlling the geometry of the space. The ray shield barriers cycling open and closed in sequences that gradually separated the Jedi from each other. First, Obi-Wan was caught behind a barrier. He stood there, pressing his hands against the energy field, watching through the glow as Qui-Gon and Maul continued alone on the other side, two masters of their respective traditions, moving against each other with the full commitment of people who understand exactly what is at stake. He could not reach them. He could only watch. The shield cycled. He ran. Another shield caught him short of his master. He watched again, helpless in the most specific way, capable and denied, able to act and structurally prevented from it, forced by the architecture of the moment into the particular anguish of the witness. Then the final barrier opened, and Qui-Gon was on the ground. What happened in Obi-Wan Kenobi in that moment is not a small thing. It deserves to be taken seriously, rather than passed over in the interest of narrative momentum. His master was dying. The man who had been his primary relationship since he was a young boy, the one who had shaped everything he was and everything he was still becoming, was lying on the floor of a reactor complex with a Sith Lord's blade through his chest. And the Sith Lord was standing there, waiting, patient, in the arrogant manner of someone who has already decided the outcome of everything that remains. Obi-Wan charged. Of course he charged. The grief and the fury and the love and the absolute refusal to be still in the face of that specific image, all of it translated instantly into motion. He came at Maul with an intensity that pushed the Sith Lord backward, that surprised him into a defensive posture he had not been expecting to need against this particular opponent. Maul, who had been controlling this engagement since its first moment, found himself suddenly confronting a problem he had not allocated attention to handling. It didn't last. Maul recovered. Dark side power and years of refined combat ability reasserted themselves. He pressed back, found the opening in Obi-Wan's assault, drove him toward the shaft, knocked the lightsaber away into the darkness, kicked him off the walkway. And now we are back to the image. Obi-Wan in the pit, Maul above him, the sparks falling. The Sith Lord savoring a moment he had already decided was complete. The thing that happened next happened in approximately 2 seconds. It deserves considerably more time than that spent on it. In the pit, clinging to the wall with his master dying a few feet above him, and a Sith Lord waiting for him at the rim, Obi-Wan Kenobi did something that was categorically impossible if you accepted the dark side's reading of what a person in that position had access to. The grief was there. The fury was there. The love and the desperation and the full weight of everything being lost in real time, none of it was gone. He had not suppressed any of it. He had not transcended it in some cold mechanical sense, had not made himself into something that felt nothing in order to function. He felt everything. He was in complete contact with all of it. And through all of it, he was still. Not the stillness of someone who has shut themselves down. The stillness at the center, the eye, the quality that his years of Soresu practice and Force meditation and the slow integration of Qui-Gon's living Force teaching had been building toward without him having a complete name for it yet. He was present in the grief without being consumed by it. He was aware of the fury without being driven by it. He was holding all of it, and none of it had taken control. And from that center, he felt his master's lightsaber. Still, somewhere in the complex. Still in the Force. The way any object is not gone, just displaced. Reachable. He reached. He drew it to himself. He launched upward, flipping over Maul in a single fluid motion, ignited the blade, and cut the Sith Lord in half before Maul fully registered that anything had changed. 3 things in 2 seconds. The reach through the Force, the physical launch and rotation, the precise strike executed from behind against a target he was passing over, in what was functionally a blind moment of complete forward commitment. 3 things that required simultaneously perfect Force attunement, perfect physical execution, and this is the one the dark side never counted: the ability to access everything you had in the middle of the worst moment you had ever lived. Not by blocking the worst moment out, not by rising above it, by being integrated enough that grief could exist inside you in full, without becoming the thing that defined what you could do. Maul had stood at the rim, savoring a victory he had not yet achieved. He had looked at the circumstances and taken them for the complete account of the person inside them. He had failed to ask the question that everything about that moment was in fact asking. What does this man have that the situation doesn't show? He would come back, of course. The dark side is nothing if not persistent. Years later, stitched together by Dathomir magic and his brother's devotion and the specific consuming hatred that sustained him through everything, Maul returned to the galaxy and to his obsession with the Jedi who had cut him down. He found Obi-Wan on Tatooine in the end. Two old men on a desert world. Neither of them had chosen. Both of them serving what the Force required without complaint. Maul attacked with his old form. The same aggressive, front-loaded pressure, the same dark side fury, the same essential philosophy he had carried since childhood. He expected defense. He expected Soresu, the patient, exhausting game, the long, grinding engagement, what he had always expected and never quite solved. Obi-Wan made a single offensive strike, and Maul fell. 3 encounters across a lifetime. 3 times the same fundamental misreading asserted itself in new clothes, carrying the same error at its center. The original mistake, a Sith Lord dragging sparks into a pit and not seeing what was in it, echoed forward across decades, finding Maul again and again in different forms, until there was no more time for it to find him in. The first mistake the dark side ever made with Obi-Wan Kenobi was deciding the matter was concluded before the matter was concluded. Every subsequent mistake was a repetition of the first. If Maul's blindness to Obi-Wan was the blindness of a predator instinctive, built from the dark side's animal machinery for threat assessment, shaped by training that had constructed precise instruments for finding danger, and then never questioned whether the instruments were complete, then Count Dooku's blindness was something considerably more refined. Therefore, in its own way, considerably more complete. Dooku was not a predator in Maul's sense. He was an aristocrat and a philosopher and a man of extraordinary accumulated learning and genuine, deeply held conviction who had spent most of a long life at the highest levels of the Jedi Order, before concluding with the cold, unsentimental precision of a man who had stopped caring what that conclusion cost him. That the institution had failed in its most fundamental purpose and was beyond the capacity of reformers to rescue. He had been Yoda's own Padawan. He had attained the rank of Jedi Master and served at the council level and been regarded for decades as one of the finest and most formidable Jedi the Order had produced in his generation. And then he had looked at what the Republic had actually become, traced the corruption spreading through it at every level, watched the Jedi Order grow so entangled in the Republic's political machinery that it could no longer distinguish between serving the light and serving the institution, and he had decided that both deserved what was coming to them. He walked away, went to Sereno, reclaimed the title and the wealth and the political standing of his family name, and eventually accepted Darth Sidious's offer to serve as the public face of what Palpatine had decided was the next necessary phase of the Sith's long plan. Dooku brought to the dark side everything the Jedi Order had spent decades building in him. The technical mastery, he was one of the most refined duelists the Order had produced in centuries. A practitioner of Makashi, the second form, which emphasized blade control and precise footwork and elegant economy of motion in a way that had made him nearly untouchable in single combat across his entire career. The political intelligence, he could read the pressures and currents of galactic politics at a level of sophistication that went beyond strategy into something closer to art. The philosophical framework, he had thought more carefully than most Jedi of his era about what the Order was supposed to be versus what it had become. and those years of careful thinking had given him a clarity about galactic history and its present trajectory that was genuinely formidable, even when his proposed remedies were catastrophically wrong. He was also, and this is the element that matters most for understanding how he saw Obi-Wan, a man who sorted people. He assessed them and placed them in categories that were stable in his mind, in a way he would not have described as inflexibility, but that functioned as inflexibility. He had very precise ideas about what constituted a genuine peer, a person worth treating as an equal, a mind and a force presence that deserved his full attention rather than a calibrated portion of it. He was not cruel about this in any theatrical way. He was simply exact, in the way that someone who has spent a life surrounded by genuine excellence and developed a refined sensitivity to its presence becomes exact. He looked at Obi-Wan Kenobi and saw a very good Jedi. This is genuinely important to distinguish from contempt. Dooku did not despise Obi-Wan. He did not regard him as worthless or as an insult to his time. What he had was something closer to professional acknowledgement, a recognition that Obi-Wan was capable, that his record was respectable, that he had done good work in service of a flawed institution. When Obi-Wan tracked the bounty hunter trail to Kamino through a chain of inference that was genuinely impressive, identifying a world that had been deliberately removed from the Jedi archive and finding it anyway through the consultation of an unconventional source and the careful application of astronomical logic, Dooku noticed. When Obi-Wan got himself captured on Geonosis, rather than abort the mission before transmitting everything he had discovered, accepting captivity as the price of getting the intelligence to the people who needed it, Dooku noticed that too. He noticed enough to try. When Obi-Wan was in the holding cell, Dooku went to him directly and offered him what was, for Dooku, a meaningful gesture. He offered him truth, a version of it. He told Obi-Wan about Sith influence in the Senate, which was real. He told him the Republic was already compromised at its foundations, which was true, though the specific mechanism of that compromise was not what Dooku was representing it to be. He invited Obi-Wan to join the effort to actually do something about it. The invitation was not purely cynical. Dooku genuinely thought there was a reasonable probability that Obi-Wan was honest enough and intelligent enough to hear what was being said and respond to it. That was its own form of recognition. He did not extend this kind of approach to Jedi. He considered completely unreachable by argument. He thought Obi-Wan might be persuadable, which meant he thought Obi-Wan was at least partially outside the most rigid form of Jedi institutional loyalty. But even while making that pitch, the category in which Dooku held Obi-Wan was still one tier below the one he reserved for people he considered genuine peers. Those people were few. Yoda, whose mastery of the Force Dooku had observed at close range for decades and genuinely revered even across the divide that now separated them. Mace Windu, whose combat ability and forceful presence Dooku treated with the particular kind of respect you extend to someone who might actually make things difficult for you. Obi-Wan was capable and worth the trouble of the recruitment conversation. He was not in that tier. The fight on Geonosis reinforced that reading without complicating it. Dooku took on Obi-Wan and Anakin together and handled them both, though with different characters of difficulty. He dispatched Obi-Wan twice clean strikes to the leg, then the shoulder with the efficient precision of someone who has assessed the threat level accurately and is applying the exact amount of force necessary to resolve it without unnecessary expenditure. Then he gave Anakin his full attention, because Anakin demanded it. Both went down before Yoda arrived, to push the engagement into genuine uncertainty. The lesson Dooku took from Geonosis was the natural one, given what he had seen. Obi-Wan was capable, but manageable. Anakin was powerful, but undisciplined. Formidable enough to require real effort, but not yet channeling that power in a way that made him genuinely effective. The Jedi Order's best were not going to be a serious problem, and buried in that natural lesson was a specific mistake that Dooku, of all the people who ever made it, should have been equipped to avoid. Dooku had spent the last phase of his Jedi career arguing with considerable precision and considerable accuracy that the Order had made exactly this kind of error in its relationship to the Republic, that they had become too comfortable with a static reading of an institution that was changing in ways they weren't tracking, that their model of the Republic's integrity was based on what the Republic had been rather than what it was currently becoming, and that the lag between the model and the reality was not merely an intellectual failure, but a moral one. He had been right. The Jedi had looked at the Republic through a frame that told them what they expected to see, and they had missed what was actually there. Dooku's assessment of Obi-Wan was the identical mistake, applied to a person rather than an institution. He had encountered Obi-Wan at a specific point in that person's development. He had formed a model, and the model had not been updated because Dooku had no mechanism for updating it. His instruments for assessing Force users were calibrated to detect the things the dark side valued: intensity, raw Force power, passion, the kind of presence that announced itself to dark side perception. The way a bright object announces itself to eyes adjusted to darkness. Obi-Wan's growth was not growth in any of those things. It was growth in something orthogonal to all of them. In the quality of his integration, his centeredness, his ability to be fully present to reality without being destabilized by anything reality brought to him. Those things did not register on Dooku's instruments. And so, from Dooku's perspective, Obi-Wan remained the version of himself that Dooku had first assessed: a very good Jedi. In a galaxy of very good Jedi, not a primary concern. He missed entirely the thing that was most relevant to his specific situation, which was that useful invisibility. That particular quality of being genuinely dangerous and completely unregistered as such, that Obi-Wan was building, encounter by encounter, a record that should have alarmed anyone assessing it honestly. And the people who most needed to assess it honestly were failing to do so because their entire framework for what constituted alarming was built around things that Obi-Wan wasn't doing. The second great mistake the dark side made with Obi-Wan Kenobi was assuming the version of him it had first encountered was the complete one. Dooku had seen a Jedi in formation and recorded that as a finished measurement. He was wrong in exactly the way he had spent years arguing the Jedi Order was wrong about the Republic. The irony of that is not gentle. General Grievous was not Sith. He carried no formal connection to the dark side tradition, no philosophical framework built around the Force's dark aspects, no real Force sensitivity worth accounting for. He was a Kaleesh military leader of genuine ability who had been catastrophically injured and then offered by interests who had carefully arranged the injury and calculated its outcome, the chance to continue existing inside a different kind of body, a mechanical body, one specifically engineered for the purpose he was going to be put to. That purpose was the systematic killing of Jedi. He had been trained in lightsaber combat by Dooku personally, given access to Jedi combat doctrine and Jedi fighting forms. and a practitioner's understanding of Jedi combat tendencies that most non-Force sensitives never had cause to develop. His mechanical body could generate 4 arms independently, each capable of wielding a lightsaber, which created a threat geometry in combat that was outside the range of what most Jedi training scenarios had prepared anyone for. He moved at speeds that organic musculature couldn't match. He felt no fatigue in the way that could be exploited. He felt no fear in the way that created hesitation at the moments when hesitation was most exploitable. He collected the lightsabers of the Jedi he killed, kept them, displayed them. The collection was not merely a habit or a vanity. It was a message, deliberate, calculated, designed to communicate something specific to the Jedi Order and to anyone watching from the outside. This is what happens to your people when they face me. This is the growing evidence of the Order's inability to handle what has been built to end it. The Terror was part of the function. A demoralized Order was a less capable Order, and that served the Sith's operational needs. Into this problem, this specific, deliberately engineered threat that had killed multiple Jedi Masters with serious combat records, the Jedi Council sent Obi-Wan Kenobi to Utapau. The choice deserves real attention, not because it was surprising in the sense of being counterintuitive, but because understanding exactly why the Council made it reveals something essential about what the Council understood that the Sith had consistently failed to see. They had options. Mace Windu's technical dueling ability was by broad consensus the finest in the active order. A practitioner Vapad, a form so demanding and so dangerous that only a handful of people had ever completed its training without being consumed by the darkness it required them to channel. Against a multiple-armed, multiple-saber opponent, Mace's precision and power would seem, by conventional logic, to be the obvious answer. They also had Anakin Skywalker, who by the final year of the war had accumulated a combat record that made simple comparison difficult, and whose raw Force ability and aggressive style made him a devastating presence in any direct confrontation. The Council sent Obi-Wan. They did not send him as a compromise or because everyone else was unavailable. They sent him because they had thought carefully about the problem and concluded that Obi-Wan Kenobi was the right answer to it. The Jedi Council, for all the failures that would mark the end of their era, were not unintelligent about combat or about what they had in their order. And what they had decided they had in Obi-Wan was the specific quality that this specific problem most required. Grievous was built on offensive pressure. Everything about how he fought was designed to overwhelm the volume of simultaneous attacks, the speed of mechanical movement, the dark side-informed aggression that Dooku had trained into him and that he used to generate the escalating momentum that cracked open his opponents. He was an answer to the standard Jedi test. He had studied how Jedi fought when they were under pressure and had been engineered to be better at exploiting that than Jedi were at withstanding it. Soresu, at the level Obi-Wan had reached, was not the standard Jedi test. It was the opposite of every assumption Grievous's methodology was designed to exploit. There are no micro-hesitations in correctly practiced Soresu because there is no energy being spent beyond what each individual defense requires, and therefore no accumulating fatigue to produce them. There is no emotional investment in the aggression for Grievous to build on. No escalation spiral for him to generate and then capitalize on. No gap between defensive moments that his offensive speed could locate and open further. The blade is simply there, covering the right angle at the right moment with minimum motion, and the practitioner behind the blade is not responding to the pressure's emotional content, not being driven by the rhythm of what Grievous is generating, not accelerating when Grievous accelerates, or tightening when Grievous concentrates. The practitioner is in the eye. Obi-Wan walked onto Utapau and presented Grievous with a problem Grievous did not have a prepared answer for. A Jedi who refused to be moved by the things that had moved everyone else, who stayed exactly as present and exactly as economical under 4 sabers as he had been before the first blade came out, who met the pressure and gave it nothing, no escalation, no panic, no opening born of rushing, and simply continued to be there. Still, while Grievous continued to spend himself trying to make something happen, the sabers came down to 2, then 1. The mechanical certainty that had carried Grievous through engagement after engagement began to encounter its structural limit, which was an opponent whose style had no structural limit accessible from the outside. Grievous fled, and Obi-Wan gave chase across the surface of Utapau with the particular calm unhurriedness of a man who has solved the significant problem and is now managing the remaining logistics. He killed Grievous with a blaster. He had famously strong opinions about blasters. He expressed those opinions frequently and with dry conviction across his entire career. He used the blaster anyway, because Grievous had a partially organic body, and the blaster could reach the organic components in a way that, in that specific configuration of the fight, a lightsaber could not do as cleanly. He set down his opinion about the right tool and picked up the tool the situation actually required. This detail is remembered as the punchline. It contains everything important. Obi-Wan held genuine preferences, real values, real opinions about how things ought to be done. And not one of those preferences or values or opinions was more important to him than the actual reality of the situation he was in. He could hold his positions lightly enough to put them down. He was not attached to his own framework in a way that would prevent him from responding accurately to what was true. That is not a small quality. It is perhaps the central quality. It is the thing that the dark side, for all its centuries of power and all its genuine philosophical sophistication about the nature of strength, never developed in any of its practitioners. Because the dark side was built on attachment, on passion, on desire, on the burning necessity of things being a certain way. The Sith were attached to their reading of the world, attached to the things they wanted, attached to the framework that told them their assessment was correct because their assessment was the foundation of their power. Obi-Wan was not attached. He was the most structurally unattached being in the entire war. And the Sith, who had built the architecture of their entire tradition on the argument that passion was strength and equanimity was weakness, had no instrument for measuring what that quality actually was in practice. Grievous had collected many lightsabers. He had none of Obi-Wan's, and what the Sith observed in the aftermath of Utapau was not what they should have observed. What they should have observed was a pattern that had been establishing itself across years. The Jedi that the Order sent to solve the problems other Jedi couldn't solve kept being the same Jedi. The one who had killed Maul on Naboo. The one who had survived Geonosis. The one who had accumulated something more than skills in those encounters. The one the Council trusted with the hardest assignments. But the Sith were watching Anakin, managing Anakin, The entire endgame ran through Anakin. And so, Anakin was what mattered. And Obi-Wan was Anakin's older brother and context. And the person standing next to the person who was actually important. That was the view from the dark side. And the bill for that view was almost ready to arrive. The full cost of every mistake the Sith had made about Obi-Wan Kenobi would not be collected in a single dramatic moment. It would be collected slowly, across years and decades, in installments that looked small from the outside and were in fact total. It would be collected on a black rock planet above a river of fire. It would be collected in a desert exile of 19 years. It would be collected in a corridor on a battle station where an old man put down his blade and stepped into something larger than himself. It would be collected by a young man who grew up protected and unknown in the care of the one person the Sith had never taken seriously enough, who became exactly what the Force needed him to become, who walked into the final confrontation carrying everything Obi-Wan had given him and accomplished what Obi-Wan had spent his entire life making possible. The Sith never feared Obi-Wan Kenobi. It was the most expensive mistake they ever made. There is a version of Anakin Skywalker that exists only in the space between what Darth Vader was and what Anakin had been. And it is in that space, that unresolved, unacknowledged, carefully walled-off interior space, that you find the most honest account of how the Sith actually related to Obi-Wan Kenobi. Because Vader's relationship with Obi-Wan was not the relationship of a Sith Lord to a defeated enemy. It was not the clean and manageable relationship of a victor to someone he had moved past. It was something considerably older and considerably stranger than that. Something that the Sith tradition had no category for, and that Vader himself, in his black armor and his mechanical breathing and his absolute commitment to being the thing Palpatine had made him, spent decades refusing to examine directly. He did not fear Obi-Wan, not in the way the dark side constructs fear, not the way he had learned to fear Palpatine, whose power and whose particular quality of patience felt like standing at the edge of something that went down further than you could see. Not the way he feared the idea of his own failure, which was, in many respects, the same thing as fearing Palpatine, since the two had become so entangled in his psychology that separating them was functionally impossible. He did not track Obi-Wan the way Palpatine tracked potential threats to the Empire, with the obsessive monitoring and the layered contingency planning and the fundamental acknowledgement that this thing deserves my full attention because it could undo me. What Vader had instead was something the dark side tradition had even less vocabulary for than it had vocabulary for Obi-Wan's brand of strength. He had an unfinished conversation, a thing that had not been resolved, a relationship that had been severed violently and incompletely on the black rock shores of Mustafar, where the man who had been his brother left him burning at the edge of a lava river and walked away, and that walking away had not been the end of anything at all, which was the problem. If it had been the end, Vader could have processed it as a defeat, filed it in the category of things the dark side overcomes and grows stronger through, and moved forward. But it wasn't the end. It was a pause. A long, terrible pause in a conversation that had been ongoing for most of both their lives. And the pause just went on and on, across years of the Empire and decades of darkness. And the conversation never stopped being unfinished. The duel on Mustafar is the most important fight of Obi-Wan's life, and perhaps the most important fight in the entire history of the Jedi Order. And it is important not because of who won it, but because of what it was. It was not a straightforward combat engagement. It was not even primarily a test of fighting ability. Though both men were at the full height of their considerable powers, it was a confrontation between two people who had known each other completely for over a decade. who had built a relationship so close and so layered and so genuinely important to both of them that even the darkness of the dark side had not been able to make Vader pretend it had never existed. He tried. The Sith tradition he was being inducted into demanded that he try. Attachments were tools of the weak. The past was to be left behind. Darth Vader was not Anakin Skywalker and had never been Anakin Skywalker, and the man on that volcano planet who had trained him and loved him like a brother was an enemy of the New Order and was to be treated accordingly. Obi-Wan did not accept that framing. He arrived on Mustafar knowing exactly what he was walking into, knowing that the man he had spent a decade training, the man he had promised to care for over a dying master's body, had become something that the Jedi tradition defined as an enemy, and that every practical instinct said should be destroyed. He walked in anyway. He did not walk in with rage or with vengeance or with the kind of burning injury that the loss of something you loved as much as Obi-Wan had loved Anakin would have produced in most people. He walked in with grief. Open, present, genuine grief. The grief of someone who understood exactly what had been lost and had not found a way to make the understanding smaller or more manageable, had not built a wall between himself and the full weight of it, was carrying the full weight of it into the conversation, because the full weight of it was what the truth of the situation required. Anakin had Padme. He had the power Palpatine had promised. He had everything the dark side had offered him. And when Obi-Wan stepped out of that ship on Mustafar and they faced each other for the first time since the fall, what came into Anakin's face was not the face of a victorious Sith Lord looking at a defeated enemy. It was the face of someone who had been found, someone whose choices had been seen and named, and whose capacity for pretending those choices were not what they were had suddenly been removed, not by accusation or argument, but by the simple presence of the person who knew him better than anyone alive. Obi-Wan said, "I have failed you, Anakin. I have failed you. Not, you have betrayed the Order. Not, you have become a monster. Not, I am here to destroy what you have become." He said he had failed him. He carried the failure as his own. He stood in front of a man who had helped burn down everything Obi-Wan had given his life to, and told him that the failure in this situation belonged to him. That was not strategy. That was not a tactical attempt to find a vulnerability. That was Obi-Wan Kenobi speaking from the truest place he had, saying the truest thing he could say in a moment when truth was the only thing that had any chance of reaching whatever was still left inside, what Anakin had become. It didn't work. Not then. The darkness had gone too deep and the fear was too strong, and Palpatine's presence too total in the architecture of who Anakin now was. The duel that followed was extraordinary. In the technical sense, two of the most accomplished Jedi-trained warriors of their generation. One now operating with the additional fuel of dark side power, the other with the complete depth of his Soresu mastery and his decades of integration, moving across the architecture of a separatist base on a volcano world. It went on longer than almost any duel in the history of that era. And there was something in the length of it that told you what the fight actually was. It was not a fight to the death. Not really. It was an argument. A long, terrible argument conducted in the language of lightsabers and force ability and everything. The two of them knew about each other's tendencies and patterns, and the specific shape of how the other person moved under pressure. Obi-Wan was not trying to kill Anakin. He was trying in the only remaining language they had between them, since every other language had been closed to reach him. And Anakin was not trying to kill Obi-Wan. He was trying to make Obi-Wan admit something, to confirm something. to respond to the darkness in a way that would validate it or condemn it or give it a shape he could live with. Both of them were failing to do what they were nominally there to do because both of them were doing something else entirely. And then the duel reached its end on a narrow embankment above a river of fire. And Obi-Wan had the high ground, and Anakin, driven by pride or fury or the dark side's fundamental incapacity to accept disadvantage, made the attack anyway. And Obi-Wan, with one movement that cost him everything he had left in him that could be spent, settled the fight and left Anakin burning at the edge of the lava. He said, "You were my brother, Anakin. I loved you." And he walked away. He did not finish it. He had the position, the moment, the physical capacity to end it. He left Anakin alive. And this is one of the most analyzed moments in the history of the Jedi. The question of why Obi-Wan left him alive on Mustafar, and the answer that makes the most sense when you understand who Obi-Wan was and what he had been building toward across his entire life, is simply this. He could not take the choice out of Anakin's hands. Anakin's arc was not complete. Whatever was still there, and something was still there. Obi-Wan could feel it even in the worst of what had happened on that planet. That thing had not yet run its course. The Force had not released Anakin yet. And Obi-Wan, who had spent his entire life learning to be aligned to the Force's actual will rather than his own preferences about what that will should be, could feel the difference between a moment that required action and a moment that required leaving things to continue. He was devastated. He was not serene. The years on Tatooine that followed were not years of easy peace. The exile cost him. The solitude cost him. The watching of a child from a distance while carrying the knowledge of everything that had converged to make that child necessary. It cost him in ways that a man who had never been required to pay those costs has no framework for fully imagining. And he could not even contact Qui-Gon for much of that time. Not fully, not visibly, because some part of his grief and his guilt over Anakin had built a wall between himself and his master's Force ghost that only came down years later, when enough of his processing was complete. But here is what Vader experienced across all the years that followed Mustafar. Obi-Wan lived in his mind, not as a defeated enemy, not as a symbol of everything the Sith had destroyed, as the unfinished thing, the conversation that had never been concluded, the person who had known him when he was still himself, who had been present for the entire arc of everything he had been before the armor and the darkness and the breathing, who carried in his memory the complete account of Anakin Skywalker in a way that Vader could not allow himself to access, but also could not make himself destroy. When they finally met again years later, on the Death Star, an old man in simple robes and a dark armored Lord of the Sith. The dynamic was not what the Sith tradition would have predicted. It was not a dominant Sith Lord finally closing an old account. It was a man who had been carrying something heavy for a very long time, confronting the person who had put it there. And Obi-Wan walked into that encounter with the same quality he had brought to every encounter of his life. Fully present, unhurried, carrying the weight of everything without being crushed by it. Knowing something Vader did not yet know, he let Vader strike him down. He lowered his blade. He disappeared. And that act, that final, utterly characteristic act of Obi-Wan Kenobi, the willingness to step out of the physical story at the exact moment when stepping out served something larger than staying in it, was the final expression of everything he had ever been. He had spent his entire life finding the position that served the Force's actual purpose, rather than his own ego or preference or survival. And in that corridor on the Death Star, the position that served the Force's purpose was the one that could not be reached by any living body, but could be maintained indefinitely by a Force ghost. He became what the situation needed him to become, and Luke Skywalker, watching, felt the grief and the fury that Obi-Wan had calculated would make him run, and ran, and carried everything Obi-Wan had given him forward into the rest of the story. Vader knelt down in that corridor and picked up the empty robes. And for a moment, just a moment, something in what remained of Anakin Skywalker reached toward the unfinished conversation one more time. The man who had been his brother was gone from the physical world, and what remained of him was more present and more capable than he had ever been. Not one Sith had feared Obi-Wan Kenobi across his entire life. Vader had carried him for decades in the specific way that you carry something you can neither face nor put down. That is not fear, but it is the shadow of something that, had it been examined honestly, should have produced it. The form is called Soresu, and if you want to understand Obi-Wan Kenobi fully, not just the outcomes of his life, but the deep structure of what made him what he was, the specific quality that the dark side could never account for, the thing that made him uniquely immune to everything the Sith tradition had been built to apply to its enemies, you have to understand Soresu, not just as a combat technique, as a philosophy, as an expression of a particular way of understanding what power actually is and how it actually works. The Jedi Order developed Soresu in response to a practical problem. Blaster technology in the middle period of the Republic had reached a level of development where single Jedi were regularly confronting multiple opponents equipped with ranged weapons, and the older, more aggressive combat forms were not giving those Jedi adequate cover. Form 4, Ataru, the acrobatic form Qui-Gon Jinn had practiced, was spectacular in single combat and required enormous amounts of space and energy and the willingness to commit to large, dramatic movements that could be read and countered. Against a single skilled opponent, it was devastating. Against 3 people, with blasters standing at different angles, it had problems. Form V, Xian and Gemso, was essentially the aggressive solution to that same problem. A form built on powerful deflections and strong ripostes, redirecting blaster fire with enough force to be actively offensive about it. Effective but expensive, required significant physical power and constant forward momentum, could be worn down. Soresu was the different answer. The answer that asked a different question. Instead of asking, how do I move fast enough and hit hard enough to overcome the fact that there are multiple threats and I have limited defensive coverage, Soresu asked, what if I gave my opponents as little to work with as possible, for as long as possible? The result was a form built entirely around compression and economy. Small movements, very small. The blade kept close to the body, covering angles efficiently without the large sweeping deflections that generate openings in your guard as they complete. Weight distributed for stability rather than speed. Nothing extended that doesn't need to be extended. Nothing committed that doesn't need to be committed. The practitioner becomes, in geometric terms, the smallest possible target, not by moving constantly and unpredictably, which is the Ataru answer, but by making every defensive position as complete as possible with the minimum expenditure of space and energy. What this means in practice is that Soresu fights differently than any other form. The practitioner does not try to dominate the engagement. They do not try to end it quickly. They do not try to overwhelm their opponent or find the decisive opening or push the tempo toward resolution. They try to stay present. They try to maintain their structure. They try to make each successive moment exactly as defensible as the moment before it. To refuse to be moved. To be the thing that does not change, while everything around it does. They are waiting, not passively active, engaged, reading every angle and every development with complete attention, but waiting in the sense that they are not driving toward a conclusion. They are allowing the conclusion to come to them when the conditions are right, when their opponent's expenditure has created something that can be answered without risk. At its lower levels, this produces a very difficult defensive fighter, hard to defeat, hard to find openings in, capable of extending engagements far longer than opponents expect, and surviving situations that more aggressive forms could not survive. These are real and significant tactical advantages, and they have kept many lives alive that more forward-oriented fighting philosophies would have lost. But at its highest levels, at the level that only a handful of practitioners in the Order's history ever reached, and that Obi-Wan Kenobi reached more completely than any of them, Soresu becomes something different in kind, rather than just degree. It becomes the eye of the storm made physical. It becomes the embodiment of the idea that there is a kind of strength that works by not being moved, not by accumulating force and releasing it, but by simply not being the thing that the storm can reach. At this level, the practitioner is not a person defending against attacks. They are a presence, a quality, something that has so thoroughly aligned itself with the stillness at the center of things that the attacks themselves begin to feel, to the person making them, like they are being poured into a space that absorbs everything and returns nothing. This is why Soresu is specifically, structurally, architecturally the worst possible fighting style for the dark side to face. The dark side runs on intensity, on escalation, on the feeling of mounting power, of feeding one's strength through the anger or the grief or the desire that grows when you press against something. The dark side requires a response. It requires the circuit to close. When a Sith Lord attacks with fury, the thing that sustains and grows the fury is the engagement, the sense that the fury is accomplishing something, generating something, that the power pouring into the attack is meeting resistance that validates it. Even a skilled defender who is resisting creates that circuit. The very act of active resistance, blocking, deflecting, pushing back, gives the dark side something to press against and grow stronger from. Soresu does not give it that. A perfectly executed Soresu defense does not resist in the way the dark side knows how to feed off. It simply is not there to be pushed against in the relevant sense. The blade is where it needs to be. The body is stable and conserved and unhurried. The practitioner is present but not responding to the emotional content of the attack, not escalating when escalated at, not providing the kind of energetic feedback that the dark side's offensive style uses as fuel. The circuit does not close. The power that the Sith pours into the attack does not find the thing it needs to multiply. It dissipates. It is spent without return. and the practitioner is still there, exactly as present as before, waiting. This is why Grievous, for all of his dark side-informed training and his 4 mechanical arms and his studied knowledge of Jedi fighting tendencies, could not solve Obi-Wan. He was built to escalate. He was built to generate mounting offensive pressure until something gave. Obi-Wan did not give. There was nothing in his engagement for Grievous to build on. The mounting offensive pressure built and then just kept building without producing the result it was supposed to produce, until the expenditure became unsustainable and something else had to change. This is why Maul, across 2 of their 3 encounters, eventually made mistakes. His style was aggression, beautiful and precise, and extraordinarily dangerous aggression. But aggression still, with all of aggression's structural dependence on the opponent providing the right kind of resistance. Obi-Wan was not interested in providing the right kind of resistance. He was interested in being still until the moment that the stillness could strike, and then striking once, completely, and being finished. And this is why even Anakin, in the full dark side power of his peak on Mustafar, with more raw force ability than almost any being in the history of that tradition, with the fury of betrayal and the burning desperation of the worst night of his life, could not finish the fight on Mustafar. He fought Obi-Wan for longer than anyone he had ever faced at that power level. He fought him across terrain that should have been tactically prohibitive. He fought him with everything he had. And what he kept running into was the quality that no amount of force power can directly defeat, which is the thing that is not moved. The still center, the eye. Obi-Wan could be lost to Anakin, had the high ground position eventually taken from him by his own pride, but he could not be simply overwhelmed, because overwhelming was not how Soresu was built to be defeated, and the people trying to overwhelm it kept spending themselves against it before the spending produced the outcome it was supposed to produce. The dark side was built to defeat people who fought back. Soresu was built to not fight back until the moment fighting back was the only remaining thing necessary. The Sith had no answer for it, because developing an answer for it would have required accepting the premise that stillness is not weakness, which is the exact premise their entire tradition was built on rejecting. Obi-Wan carried the highest mastery of that form in recorded Jedi history. He carried it in his body and in his center, and in the quality of his presence in every situation he ever entered. And the Sith never understood what they were looking at when they looked at him. They saw a defensive fighter. They saw a careful and conservative Jedi who would not press his advantages aggressively. They saw a man without fire. They saw everything the dark side had been trained to dismiss. They did not see the eye of the storm, and they spent decades walking into the storm while looking for something that looked more like a threat. And the storm was never anything other than exactly what it appeared to be. Let us set aside the philosophy for a moment and look at the record. Just the record. What actually happened? Who was there? What was accomplished? Not through the lens of how dramatic it looked from the outside, through the lens of what it actually meant for the outcome of the galaxy's story. Obi-Wan Kenobi, as a Padawan, not yet a Jedi Knight, not yet formally trained to the level of completion, in the worst moment of his life, with his master dying a few feet away and his weapon somewhere in the dark below him, killed Darth Maul, a Sith Lord. The Sith tradition's premier weapon of that era, a being raised from childhood to be the most dangerous thing Darth Sidious could produce, and pointed at the Jedi Order for exactly this kind of purpose. Obi-Wan killed him in 2 seconds from inside a pit. No other Padawan in the history of the Jedi Order did anything remotely comparable to this. The closest analogies require decades of subsequent context that make them meaningful in retrospect. Obi-Wan's kill on Naboo was meaningful the moment it happened. He was not yet finished in his training. He was not yet what he would become, and he killed a Sith Lord in the worst possible set of circumstances imaginable. The Sith noted this. They did not note it enough. Obi-Wan Kenobi was the only Jedi who fought General Grievous and walked away from the engagement cleanly. Grievous, as discussed, had killed Jedi Masters, not promising young knights, masters, people who had spent decades becoming exactly what the Jedi Order spent lifetimes trying to produce. Grievous took their weapons as trophies, multiple of them. The collection was a catalogue of fallen Jedi excellence. Obi-Wan went to Utapau and came back. He came back having eliminated Grievous, having done so without injury, having accomplished the mission the Council had identified him as the right person for. His lightsaber did not go into a collection. It went back onto his belt. He used a blaster for the finishing shot and commented on uncivilized weapons and moved on. This is not a small achievement. The Sith treated it as a footnote in the larger story of Revenge of the Sith, a logistical development in the war that cleared one obstacle from Palpatine's path. It was not a footnote. It was evidence, added to an accumulating body of evidence of what Obi-Wan Kenobi actually was. The evidence was accumulating in plain view. Nobody with a vested interest in what it meant was looking at it. Obi-Wan Kenobi fought Anakin Skywalker at the absolute peak of Anakin's dark side power and held him to a draw that resolved only on a question of positioning. This requires a moment of genuine attention, because what is being said here is not simply a statement about the fight on Mustafar. It is a statement about what it means that the fight on Mustafar went the way it did. Anakin Skywalker, at the moment he stepped onto the ground of Mustafar, was arguably the most powerful Force user in the history of the living galaxy. His raw connection to the Force was greater than any recorded being's. His emotional state was at a pitch of dark side intensity that should have made him functionally unstoppable in direct combat. He had given himself completely to the darkness. He had burned every bridge he could reach. He had nothing left to lose, in the way that people with nothing left to lose are sometimes the most dangerous things alive. He was Darth Vader in that moment, fully and completely and without reservation. And he was fighting his former master. And the fight lasted long enough to constitute an argument. Obi-Wan did not win by overpowering Anakin. He won by surviving long enough for Anakin to do something that the dark side's pride makes its practitioners chronically vulnerable to, which was to attempt an attack across a positional disadvantage so severe that no amount of power could compensate for the geometry of it. He won by being the thing that could not be moved until the thing that needed to happen had happened. He won by being Soresu, by being the eye of the worst storm he would ever face, which was the storm of his own grief and love and the full weight of what Anakin had become, and staying in the center of it without breaking until the moment came, and then using that moment with the complete, unhesitating precision that defined everything he had ever done. What this means, stripped of sentiment, is that Obi-Wan Kenobi fought the most powerful dark side user in living history to a standstill in the most emotionally devastating circumstances imaginable, while carrying the grief of what was being lost in the same moment he was fighting it. No Sith ever squared with what that meant. Not a single one of them built it into their assessment of what Obi-Wan represented. Obi-Wan Kenobi kept the secret of Luke Skywalker for 19 years. 19 years. On a planet the Sith knew Anakin Skywalker had grown up on, with a family that bore the same name as Anakin's stepbrother, visible enough that Darth Vader apparently rode through the same region of that planet at some point during the Imperial years without finding what was there. He kept it not through spectacular counterintelligence or military protection or any of the methods that would typically be associated with hiding the most important secret in the galaxy. He kept it by being exactly what he had always been: unremarkable, present, patient, a worn old hermit in the desert who nobody of consequence had ever looked at twice, because nobody of consequence had ever decided he was worth looking at twice. He kept it by being the thing the Empire's instruments were calibrated to miss. He had been practicing for that specific function his entire life without knowing it. 19 years. The Sith never found the boy. The boy became exactly what the Force needed him to become. And then he walked into the final confrontation, carrying everything Obi-Wan had given him. Obi-Wan Kenobi set in motion the precise sequence of events that ended the Sith forever. Not through grand action, not through a dramatic campaign or a decisive military engagement, or the kind of bold, visible stroke that gets written into the history books with the names of generals and heroes. He did it by finding a frightened farm boy in a desert and telling him the truth about who he was, by training him in the time available, by stepping off the stage of his own life at exactly the right moment to become something more useful than a living man could have been. He did it by having spent his entire life building the exact qualities that the exact situation required, without ever knowing precisely what situation was coming. He did it by being aligned to the Force's will so completely that when the moment arrived, he recognized it and responded to it without hesitation, without ego, without the need to be the one who completed the story rather than the one who made the completion possible. None of these things looked dramatic from the outside. None of them produced the kind of image that ends up on historical monuments or in the breathless accounts written by people who witnessed turning points. A young Padawan dispatching a Sith Lord in 2 seconds looks dramatic in retrospect, but at the time, it looked like a lucky moment in a desperate situation. An old general sent to kill a cyborg commander looks like wartime logistics. A fight on a volcano that nobody wins cleanly, followed by one man walking away and the other left to burn, looks like tragedy. An old hermit dying quietly so a young man can run that barely looks like anything at all from any distance. But look at what it adds up to. Look at what the whole sequence amounts to when you lay it out and count it. Darth Maul, dead. The Sith's greatest weapon of terror in that era, eliminated while it was still a Padawan's first fight. The Separatist military machine, decapitated. Grievous, the Jedi killer, the symbol of Jedi vulnerability, taken out by the one Jedi whose approach he had no answer for. Anakin Skywalker's complete destruction, prevented by being left with the physical capacity, however reduced, however suffering, to eventually be rebuilt into Vader and, more critically, to be capable of the choice that Vader made on the Death Star 23 years later. If Obi-Wan had finished it on Mustafar, the prophecy dies. Anakin has to be alive to fulfill it. Obi-Wan felt that. He left him alive, the chosen one, delivered to his destiny intact. Luke Skywalker, protected for 19 years, trained in the time available, sent into the final act of the Sith's history, carrying the specific combination of qualities, hope and love, and the willingness to believe redemption was possible that no approach built on power or fury or clever tactical planning could have produced. The chain goes unbroken. The thread holds. The Force finds its way back to balance. And the one person most responsible for the integrity of that chain, the one person whose decisions across its entire length were most consequential for its survival, was the one person the Sith never seriously accounted for. That is not an accident. That is the specific content of the mistake. That is exactly what it means to look at the galaxy through a lens that can only see threats that resemble you. There is one more thing that needs to be said before we turn to the structural nature of the mistake, and it has to do with what the Force itself appeared to understand about Obi-Wan Kenobi that the Sith never did. The Force, in the Star Wars tradition, is not a passive energy field. It is not simply the fuel that Force users draw upon to accomplish their purposes. It has something that functions like a will, something that functions like a preference for certain outcomes over others, a lean toward balance, a tendency to produce what it needs through whatever channels are available. The Jedi spent centuries trying to read that will and align themselves to it. The Sith spent centuries trying to master it, to subordinate it to their own purposes, to use it as a tool rather than follow it as a guide. And the tension between those two relationships with the Force is, in some respects, the entire history of the conflict between them. But what the Sith could never account for, in their model of how the Force worked, was the possibility that the Force itself might make use of people in ways that did not register on the instruments of power, that the Force might have something like a sense of humor, or at least a sense of irony, that the being most responsible for its eventual rebalancing might be the one who looked least impressive by the metrics the Sith used to assess what impressive meant. The Jedi historians and philosophers who later studied Obi-Wan's life noted something that appears in different forms across the accounts of everyone who knew him well: a persistent quality of being in exactly the right place at exactly the right time, in ways that could not always be explained by planning or foresight, or even the exceptional situational awareness he possessed. He was on Tatooine when Qui-Gon found Anakin. He was the one who tracked the clone army to Kamino when no other trail existed. He was sent to Utapau to find Grievous when the Council needed it done right. He was on Mustafar when the confrontation that would shape the next 20 years needed a witness and a participant who could survive it and carry forward what needed to be carried. He was on Tatooine when the boy who would end the Sith needed to be found. These are not coincidences in the lazy sense of things that simply happen to overlap. These are the accumulation of a life lived in consistent and genuine alignment with something larger than personal preference or calculated strategy. Obi-Wan was not the most powerful Force user in his era, but he may have been the most consistently aligned to the Force's actual will in his era, and alignment across the long arc of the Force's purposes produces a kind of relevance that raw power alone cannot replicate. The Sith could not see this because they were not looking for it and did not have a framework in which it would register as meaningful. Their model of Force use was transactional. You brought power to the Force. The Force returned power. The exchange was legible and measurable and could be ranked and compared. They could not see a relationship with the Force that was not primarily about what you extracted from it. They could not see the alternative, which was a relationship built on listening, on aligning, on doing the work of becoming the kind of vessel through which the Force could act without distortion. That relationship looked, from the outside, and from the dark side's vantage point, like passivity, like following, like the absence of the kind of aggressive self-assertion that the Sith tradition identified as strength, it was the opposite of passivity. It was the hardest thing there is, which is being willing to let what is actually real be more important than what you want to be real. Being willing to align to the Force's will, even when the Force's will involves 19 years of desert exile and watching from a distance and doing nothing dramatic. Being willing to step out of your own story at the moment the story needs you to stop being in it. Being willing to be the context rather than the subject, the background rather than the foreground. The old man nobody of consequence has looked at twice, because that is the role the Force has asked you to play. And you are, at your deepest level, the kind of being who plays the role you are asked to play, rather than the role you might have preferred. The Sith built their tradition on the idea that the strongest individuals shape the Force to their will. What Obi-Wan's life demonstrates, from beginning to end, is that there is a different relationship available. One in which an individual shapes themselves to the Force's will with such completeness that the Force moves through them toward its purposes with almost no resistance, and that the results of that second relationship, measured in actual galactic outcomes, exceed the results of the first relationship by every meaningful metric. The Sith had the power. Obi-Wan had the alignment. And in the long run of the Force's purposes, alignment won. The mistake the Sith made with Obi-Wan Kenobi was not a mistake of information. It was not that they lacked access to the facts of his record or the details of his encounters or the observable track of what he accomplished across the years they shared a galaxy. The facts were available. The encounters were documented. The pattern was visible to anyone willing to look at it honestly and ask what it meant. The mistake was structural. It was built into the architecture of how the Sith understood power and threat, and the nature of what made something dangerous. And because it was structural, it was not correctable from within the tradition. You cannot fix a blind spot using only the instruments that the blind spot prevents you from seeing. The Sith tradition, the tradition as Bane had reformulated it, as Plagueis had refined it, as Sidious had brought it to its terrifying culmination, was built on the claim that passion was the foundation of real strength. That the things the Jedi released were actually the things that made you powerful. That detachment was weakness in philosophical dress. That the path to genuine power ran through your deepest wounds and your most consuming needs, through the willingness to let those things drive you past the limits that other people accepted as natural. This is what the Sith believed. This is what their entire tradition was structured to produce and to deepen and to transmit. And it was not entirely wrong. It produced real power. Palpatine was genuinely terrifying. Vader was genuinely terrifying. The dark side's ability to fuel itself through intensity and need, and the bottomless hunger for things to be other than they were, that was real. It worked. It had worked across centuries, but it had a shadow. Every absolute claim about the nature of power creates a shadow, a space that the absolute claim refuses to illuminate, because illuminating it would require acknowledging that the claim is not absolute. The Sith shadow was everything that the dark side dismissed as weakness, and that was not actually weakness. Everything that looked, through the lens of passion, as power, like the absence of strength, but was in fact a different expression of it, a kind that the dark side had no instruments to measure and therefore no capacity to be properly afraid of. Equanimity, patience, the willingness to be in the worst situation without needing the situation to be other than it was, the capacity to act from a centered stillness rather than from accumulated intensity. the ability to be present in grief without being swept away by it, present in danger without being driven by it, present in loss without being consumed by it. These things look, from the dark side's vantage point, like the absence of the things that matter. They look like a person who has been trained out of their natural responses, emptied of the fire that would make them really dangerous, made into a competent but fundamentally non-threatening practitioner of the Jedi way. They are not those things. They are the expression of a completeness, a quality of integration and of genuine alignment with what is real that the dark side, by the fundamental structure of its own commitments, could never produce in any of its practitioners. Because the dark side requires need. It requires the burning dissatisfaction with what is and the desperate reaching for what is not. It requires the gap between what you have and what you want to remain open and painful and motivating. Because closing the gap, actually arriving at peace with what is, removes the fuel. A Sith who arrives at genuine equanimity has ceased, in some fundamental sense, to be operating from what the Sith tradition runs on. This means that the Sith tradition, across the entire length of its existence, could not produce an Obi-Wan Kenobi. Not because such qualities are impossible in principle, but because the practice of the dark side systematically burns them away in every practitioner who commits to it seriously. The fire is real, the power is real, and the thing that the fire consumes in every Sith who feeds it is the specific quality that would allow them to see clearly that someone like Obi-Wan is not simply a capable Jedi, but an existential problem. Palpatine was the most intellectually formidable Sith in the history of the tradition, and he is the clearest case of this blindness. He spent decades playing the galaxy as a game board. He tracked every significant piece. He planned for contingencies that his enemies couldn't imagine he had considered. He was genuinely brilliant in his management of information and threat and the long, patient arc of his plan. And he never seriously accounted for Obi-Wan Kenobi. Not because he lacked the information, because the framework through which he processed information was built in a way that produced a specific and consistent blind spot in the shape of everything Obi-Wan was. He watched Anakin for years. He managed Anakin with extraordinary precision. He assessed Mace Windu with enough care and enough genuine wariness that when the moment came, he had already prepared the specific approach he would use to survive it. He watched Yoda and respected the depth of Yoda's connection to the Force with the specific kind of respect the powerful extend to something genuinely equal. And Obi-Wan he filed as Anakin's context, as the reliable but non-critical piece in a game whose critical pieces were somewhere else. The night of Order 66, when Palpatine's trap was sprung and the Jedi Order fell in the space of hours, the pieces Palpatine most needed to resolve were Yoda and Mace. They were the threats the dark side's instruments had identified as requiring the most direct attention. Obi-Wan was on Utapau. The clone troopers there received the order. He was shot off his Varactyl into the water below. The report came back as confirmed, eliminated. And Palpatine moved on. He was wrong. Obi-Wan survived. Of course Obi-Wan survived. Because what Palpatine could not model about Obi-Wan was that the same quality that made him look non-threatening to dark side perception was the same quality that made him uniquely difficult to actually kill. A being whose center cannot be reached by panic or by the expected responses to sudden lethal danger is going to respond to a clone trooper assassination attempt in ways that the assassination attempt is not designed to account for. He was in the water before the shots found him. He moved correctly under pressure, exactly as correctly as he always moved, because the pressure did not reach the center, because the center was the eye, because it was always the eye. He survived the night the Sith destroyed everything else. He survived because the Sith had been too confident in the effectiveness of the tool and too comfortable with their prior assessment of him as non-critical to design the elimination attempt with the care they would have brought to someone they actually feared, if they had feared him. If even one mind in the Sith tradition had genuinely assessed what Obi-Wan Kenobi represented and communicated that assessment upward in a way that changed how the dark side prioritized him, the approach to Order 66 might have been different. The approach to Mustafar might have been different. The approach to the 19 years of his exile might have been different. If someone had sat down with the complete record and asked the right question, not who is the most powerful, not who burns brightest, not who most resembles a threat the Sith have faced before, but rather who is the most difficult to account for, who is most likely to be where the story actually turns, the answer would have come back as Obi-Wan every time. If the question had been asked correctly, the question was never asked correctly, because asking it correctly would have required questioning the framework. And the framework was the tradition. And questioning the tradition was, by definition, not what the Sith did. That is the specific shape of the mistake. Not a lapse in intelligence. Not a failure of individual attention on a bad day. A systematic structural blindness built into the most successful dark side tradition in galactic history that ensured it would always miss exactly the kind of threat that Obi-Wan Kenobi represented. A hole in the net in the exact shape of the thing that mattered most, and the thing that was shaped exactly like the hole slipped through it again and again and again for the entire length of the Sith's existence in its final form. Come back to Naboo. Come back to the reactor complex. Come back to that image and let it settle now, with everything we have traced sitting behind it, with the full weight of what that moment became sitting in the silence around it. Darth Maul is at the edge of the pit. The double-bladed crimson saber is in his hands, still lit, and he is dragging its tip slowly along the metal edge of the shaft. Sparks are falling. Obi-Wan is below him, one hand on a pipe in the wall, the other hand empty. Qui-Gon is dying a few feet away. The whole operation has gone, from Maul's perspective, exactly as it was supposed to go. The significant threat has been neutralized. The formality is being allowed to dangle for a moment before resolution. Below the rim, in the dark of the pit, with sparks falling around him and everything he had ever known bleeding away above him, there is a young man who is about to do something that will redefine the next 3 decades of galactic history, not by doing something spectacular, not by revealing a hidden power that had been building toward this moment, by being, in the worst moment of his life, the thing he had spent years becoming, by finding the center when the center was the only thing left to find, by reaching through grief and fury and the full weight of loss toward the specific object, his master's lightsaber, and drawing it to himself with the complete clarity of someone who is still present when everything around them has collapsed. 2 seconds, 3 movements, 1 strike, Maul falls. And what Obi-Wan Kenobi goes on to do, from that moment in the pit until the moment he steps into something beyond the physical, in a corridor, on a battle station, a long time later. What he goes on to do is the most quietly extraordinary sequence of any life in the history of the Jedi Order. He trains the Chosen One. He fights 2 Sith Lords and a Sith-trained cyborg, and he is not destroyed by any of them. He stands at the edge of Mustafar and holds the worst moment of his life without breaking. He goes to the desert. He waits. He watches. He keeps the secret that the future runs through. He finds Luke Skywalker and tells him about a father he has never known, about a force he cannot yet feel, about a destiny that the old man in the desert has been keeping intact across 19 years of absolute solitude, because the Force asked him to, and because he was the one who could. He puts down his blade in a corridor and becomes something that cannot be struck down. He speaks to Luke from the Force itself and guides him through the trench of a battle station and helps him find the moment to fire. He stands at Luke's shoulder in the cave on Dagobah and lets Luke understand something about fear. He watches from wherever Force ghosts watch from as the son of the Chosen One walks into the final confrontation, carrying everything that every generation of careful guardianship had been protecting. He never drew attention to any of this. He never claimed credit. He never positioned himself as the center of anything. He was always, to almost every observer, the context, the background, the reliable and steady presence beside the more interesting story. The man standing next to the person who was actually important. The Sith never understood that the man standing next to the person who was actually important was, in fact, the reason the important person's story had somewhere to go. That is the whole of it. That is the entire content of the mistake the dark side made across 60-some years of the same era. They looked for fire and found calm. They looked for need and found settledness. They looked for the wound they could press and found a center that held. They looked for the thing that resembled a threat. And what was actually there did not resemble a threat. And so they looked past it and past it and past it, until the thing they had been looking past had already won. Obi-Wan Kenobi was never the Jedi the Sith were built to fear. He was something they had no category for. A man so completely himself that the dark side's instruments returned nothing when they pointed at him. A man whose power was his peace, whose strength was his stillness, whose weapon was the quality of being fully present in every moment without needing that moment to be other than it was, and who was therefore immune, in the deepest possible way, to the specific mechanism through which the Sith had built their entire tradition of destroying Jedi. They dragged sparks down onto him in a pit on Naboo when he was 25 years old and decided the matter was concluded. The matter was not concluded. The matter was, in that moment, just beginning. And what it eventually became, what that young man in the pit eventually became, what he built and protected and finally gave over to the next generation at exactly the right moment, in exactly the right way, is the full and complete answer to every dismissal the Sith ever made. They never feared him. It was the most expensive mistake they ever made, and they made it from the very beginning. And they never stopped making it. And the galaxy is balanced today because they couldn't.